depreciation without touching the nominal exchange rate. You know, there are hundreds of papers, hundreds of experiences, hundreds of very dramatic recessions which suggest that. 1982, in the month of May, General Pinochet, not exactly a soft man himself, said that over his dead body would the Chilean peso be devalued from its parity of 39 pesos to the dollar. He said, to show you that is the case, we're going to cut all public wages by 10%. A month later, the Chilean peso was devalued. 10 years later, in 20 years later, almost 19 years later, in 2001, Argentina was exactly in the same predicament, and Super Minister Domingo Cavallo told the world that Argentina would never devalue. What were they going to do? They were going to go through the pain of a big recession, do internal devaluation, and what would they signal the change with? A 10% cut in, public sector wages. Well, a month later, Argentina devalued. So, two observations in some quarters make for a theory. If your public sector says we're going to cut our wages by 10%, prepare for a devaluation. And I am aware that, there are exceptions to this rule. Eric Bergloff told us about the Baltics yesterday. I was not at the talk, but yes, the Baltics may be an exception. But of course, they are an exception that consists of 3 very small countries next to a very large country called Russia. Uruguay is a very small country next to a very large country called Brazil. It's not quite the same thing. So yes, maybe the Baltics have shown the way. I am skeptical. And if the Baltics have not shown the way, then the Latin American view would be either be prepared to give up the common currency or be prepared for a very, very, very long recession in the southern countries of Europe. That's lesson number 3. Lesson number 4. Phoenix miracles happen, but don't count on it. Now, for the uninitiated, what the hell is a Phoenix miracle? Phoenix miracle is what, again, Guillermo Calvo, one of the world's greatest economists, calls those recoveries that happen without credit. And in fact, if you look at balance sheet recessions around the world over the last 25 years, you do find that some happen without credit. In fact, Mexico, after the big tequila crisis of 1994-95, is an example of a country that grew a lot without credit. But of course, Mexico is somewhat unusual. It happens to be next to the United States, and it happens to have suffered a massive, 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 massive real depreciation against the US dollar. So no wonder you could grow out of the crisis without any credit by simply exporting to the US under a very depreciated parity. If you take out countries where a big depreciation happened, it is very hard to find recoveries without any credit. And of course, in Europe today, the basic problem is that there is very little credit. Not because there's very little money, but simply because the banks, as Richard pointed out, are sitting on very large piles of cash and they are refusing to lend it. If you want to get the banks to lend, and this is my lesson number 5, there are 2 things that you ought to be doing. And Europe is doing exactly the opposite. The first thing that you ought to be doing is you should be getting government bonds which are risky off the balance sheet of the banks. Right? You want to make sure the banks buy something else than government paper, and therefore government policy should be designed to provide incentives for the banks to lend to the private sector, not for the banks to lend to the governments. But of course, current ECB policy is exactly the opposite. LTRO is nothing but an attempt to get banks to buy government debt. And as Markus Brunnermeier pointed out yesterday, this is a very nasty link indeed. Once you have banks holding lots of government debt, and that government debt is dicey, the chances you will have a bank run or a bank crisis is large. If you want evidence of that, there's no better case than Argentina 2001, which is exactly what happened. And mind you, as in Europe, a lot of the government paper did not begin on the books of the banks. The government paper was put on the books of the banks precisely when the government was getting into trouble. A few weeks later, the banks were in trouble. A few months later, the country was in trouble. So, lesson from Latin America, take government debt off the books of the banks. Europe is doing exactly the opposite. The other lesson from Latin America is if you want the banks to lend, well, yes, do make sure that banks have enough capital, but don't do it quite yet. You know, Latin American countries are Catholic, and therefore we read St. Augustine, and you all know that he said in the Confessions, Lord, please make me chaste, but not quite yet, right? Bank capital is exactly of that kind. You know, you want banks to be capitalized, but not quite yet. If you force banks to be capitalized right now, what they will do, well, of course, they will shrink balance sheets, they will sell assets, they will lend less, and therefore the recession will be deepened. So, on both counts of what Latin American countries learned we ought to be doing to get banks to lend, Europe is doing exactly the wrong thing. Last but not least, let me say two things about fiscal policy, and I will stop and I will win the prize for the biggest exercise in brevity. Oh, no, maybe Sergey beat me. Okay, I will try. Idea number 6. There is no such thing as an expansionary fiscal contraction. I suspect most of the people doing the applauding are British. Well, let me take that back. There are a couple of papers which show a couple of examples, Ireland in the 80s and Denmark in the 80s. But what do they have in common? Well, of course, they have in common the fact that they had their own currencies and they could engage in massive real depreciations, and therefore you could export your way out of a crisis. However, go out and find a case of a country which had a massively appreciated real exchange rate, no currency of its own, very little credit, which on top of that applied a very large fiscal adjustment, and on top of that it grew, you know. Olivier Blanchard, who's a very serious man, put his men and women at the IMF to look for that example. They simply couldn't find it. So the idea that you can do that and grow is fairly insane. Certainly the Latin American experience would suggest that in fact it is insane. What is to be done? Again, forgive me, I'm not Catholic, but I keep quoting Catholic saints. Again, you want to ask for chastity, but not quite yet. You do need, of course, a fiscal adjustment in Europe, but you want it backloaded. You want it in the future. You don't want it in the present. Which takes me to my last point, how to make that happen. How do you make a fiscal adjustment 5 years from now credible? Well, you do so by adopting fiscal rules. And fiscal rules and a fiscal compact, of course, are the rage here in Europe today. I have bad news for you. A bunch of other countries have been doing the same thing over the last few decades. Some European countries outside the EU, like Sweden, some non-European countries like Chile. This is what I spent the last 5 years doing. I became the most hated man in the country for a few years by imposing a fiscal rule. Then the crisis came, Lehman Brothers saved me, and I became a somewhat less hated man in the country. So what did I learn about fiscal rules? Well, fiscal rules need to be credible, but in order to be credible, they need to satisfy political constraints. They have to be politically feasible. And in order to be politically feasible, they have to be flexible enough. The rules that in the world have been applied again and again and again have been rules that take the economic cycle into account. They tend to be cyclically adjusted rules, structurally adjusted rules, that sort of thing. That's what Chile has, and it has been in operation for 10 years. Very simple rules are simply not credible, even when they're very tough. What was the problem with Maastricht? The conventional wisdom is to say 60%, 3% was not tough enough, therefore it was violated, therefore it was no good. My reading is exactly the opposite. Maastricht was not credible precisely because it was too mechanical. And it was so mechanical that when push came to shove, even Germany, even Holland, even Finland, every country in Northern Europe violated them. So the lesson there from Latin America is, yes, you do need to make backloaded adjustments credible. You need to use rules for this, but you need rules that are very sophisticated, that are cyclically adjusted, and that are flexible enough. I am told that the European Compact will make this happen, but I have learned, having run one of these rules for a number of years, that the devil is in the details. The details are not out yet, and therefore, on that point, I am still siding with the devil. Those are my 7 rules. Let me end with one word of advice for INET. INET is in the business of promoting new thinking, new research, new papers for new journals, and that is all good. As a practicing economist, of course, I welcome that, Rob. However, I do want to go back to my initial point. Every single thing that I have said in the last 10 minutes in fact, can be found in a reputable journal. There are dozens of papers, and I'm talking about dozens